This week on Application Security Weekly, we will be covering the OWASP Top 10 2017 release, a learning tool called devdocs.io, as well as some more news about Meltdown Inspector, some WebLogic flaws in Oracle, and more. All that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. This episode is brought to you by IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. IT Pro TV offers an on-demand course library with more than 3,300 hours of content. Watch on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for Teams with a special offer for Security Weekly listeners. Visit itpro.tv/Security Weekly to start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off a standard or premium IT Pro TV membership using the code SECWEEKLY30. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome, everyone, to this week's Application Security Weekly. I am joined by my co-host, the illustrious Paul Asadori. Paul, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Keith. We didn't tell you that they'd be cutting to you right after that. A lot of what we do here is improvisation, which is totally fine.
The best part is like developing in production, right? Like literally, that's what we're doing here. We are pushing to master.
That's right. That's right. We are. We're deploying some new containers and not telling anyone that we did. So, Keith, thank you. I think, for these shows where I am not the primary host, I'm just here to try and look pretty, usually failing at that, that this format works. I'm excited for episode 1, which is not the first episode because this is Application Security Weekly, and we started with episode 0. So episode 1 is, in fact, the second episode, which is awesome. I'm excited for all things application security.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. In this case, we count appropriately here on Application Security Weekly. Arrays start with 0. So do we have any announcements, Paul? I know that I think I put some in there. I don't know if these were carryover from last week from what I copied over, but if there's any announcements you want to give, jump right on in. Yeah,
so we have some on-demand material available. We have 5 webcasts that you can go watch that we've done in collaboration with our sponsors. I do want to say that I think when some people hear webcast and they hear sponsor, they're like, oh my God, it's going to be death by PowerPoint, and the sponsor's just going to give a sales pitch. I promise you that our content is not that. That Security Weekly hosts present some of the content, and we present content with our sponsors in collaboration with them. In fact, in 2018, our team is spending even more time with the various vendors that sponsor the webcast to help them refine their message, to help them develop content that we believe will be the most useful to our audience. So you can see examples of that at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Go register today. Also, IT Pro TV /Security Weekly, as you saw the ad in the beginning of the show. Binge-worthy learning. That's right. You can go get a subscription for your team. Keith, I don't know if you've delved into IT Pro TV yet. I don't know if do we get you an account? We're working on
an account.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really excited actually because they not only have some great content from the security perspective, as well as, of course, those folks that are on the defender side, not just offensive security focused here, but they've also got some developer focused content. So I'm going to be looking at their Vue.js course, which is a new framework that I've been turned on to by some of my friends over at Microsoft for, in this case, developing out new websites.
That's awesome. It's awesome. You have to let us know how it goes. InfoSec World March 19th through the 21st. You can get 15% off with the code OS18-SW. I will be presenting there as well as many others. We will also have a booth there as Security Weekly where we'll be doing some type of security hacker-related trivia. I'm not sure what that's going to look like yet. I will probably come up with all new trivia questions, although the hacker movie trivia is, I think, by far the most popular, so we may feature that, even though many people may already know the answers. I'll have to come up with some new hacker movie trivia questions. And we're doing a webcast with Domain Tools. Michael Santarcangelo and I will be both in here in studio. We'll be poo-pooing logs and talking about how you can do detecting indicators of compromise through domains and IP addresses and the intelligence that comes from them. Domain Tools is the expert. I actually started playing around with their tool Iris, and I tell you what, for investigating a domain, I haven't seen a better tool out there, and I just started playing around with it, and I was like, oh my god, like this is stuff that I would spend a lot more time using a suite of tools to collect information about a domain. It's just all there in front of you in the interface, and I haven't even delved into some of the analytics that they provide in correlation. So awesome stuff. Make sure you check that out, securityweekly.com/domain tools. That'll do it for announcements, and we're leading off, Keith, with the OWASP Top 10, which has been updated for 2017, 2018? Recently
2017.
Updated? Okay.
Yeah, recently updated. You might recall some of the controversy around the OWASP Top 10 2017 earlier in 2017 related to the RC1 release, which basically the top 10 that was proposed had some influence by those who shall remain nameless, but a company who was, their CTO was on like the decision committee for the OWASP Top 10 and basically injected right into one of the actual top 10s, basically their company's product, for lack of better words. So what has happened is after that controversy was kind of played out, the committee that then decides on what the top 10 is going to be released as was somewhat reformed. They came back and they actually looked at some data that not only BugCrowd, but a number of other companies have gone ahead and put forward to the OWASP Top 10 to make decisions as to what should now be considered the next kind of things to pay attention to in application security, and have since released that update. Before I dive too much into it, Paul, I imagine you're at least modestly familiar with the top 10, and I want to give you an opportunity to give maybe your general understanding of what the top 10 is and how that might be representative of the broader audience, and then we can dive deeper into what it actually is, and in this case, what has been updated on it.
Yeah, I think it's been a good reference for the security community to understand what some of the major threats are to applications. I've also used kind of the outside of the top 10 list. OWASP, they have many different entries kind of in their database that I think are almost more valuable to me than the top 10 list. Well, the top 10 list is valuable. When I look at some kind of new or existing attack that I haven't looked into in a while, and I want to get a general overview to kind of refresh my memory on what a deserialization attack is, which I always have to go back and look up because there's a lot of different ways to present and both exploit a deserialization attack. So I'll go to OWASP website, and they'll have a nice little description. It's not like anything in depth, but it's a nice little overview with a couple of examples. And the OWASP Top 10, I think, just focuses on some of those 10 major issues in a more overarching sense, which, I think it should be a goal that you're addressing these, but also, as Keith and our listeners know, there's a lot more to application security than just those 10 things. And a lot of depth inside, like the first one, for example, in injection. That's a whole ton of stuff inside there. So I think it's a good reference that we can kind of standardize on these 10 things. But, there's a lot more to application security than just a top 10 list.
For sure. And one of the things that we're actually going to talk about next week, and this is why I put the top 10 first, because it's probably the most well-known out of what OWASP produces, is the application security verification standards. So something that we're going to follow in on after this episode, so next week's episode, episode 2, is talking a little bit more of what's probably going to be useful from the testing perspective, but as well as from the developer side. The OWASP top 10, from everything that I have seen, is really trying to get developers to think about different vulnerability classes in a way that's kind of simplified and makes sense for them. what is interesting about this is they do go a little bit broader in terms of the way that they define some of the
Mm-hmm.
problems. And then from there, in each different subsection, they actually go into like what that problem is, how it is presented, and then sometimes how to fix it. As you mentioned, the first and the biggest one on the top 10 is injection. So in this case, they actually talk about not only SQL injection, which is what most people go
Mm-hmm.
to when they start to think about these things, but also NoSQL injection. And so when people are like, what's NoSQL injection? Think about Mongo databases. Basically, they have a different format in the way in which they are brought together. So Mongo uses like a JSON format, for example, and they're not as structured as your traditional like Postgres or MySQL database. And so
There's no SQL. There's no structured query language inside of some of these databases.
right, exactly. And so in the case of NoSQL, there is still injection there. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
at one of my training classes that I gave at DerbyCon last year, I specifically put in a NoSQL authentication bypass. So there are a whole class of vulnerabilities that are still somewhat at the forefront of research and now in this case offensive security testing, because everybody's switching over from the traditional SQL model to NoSQL databases such as Mongo, which we've had a slew of problems with in 2017 with like ransomware related attacks.
Now, Keith, I want to ask you a very self-serving question. If I were to be considering developing an application that, let's say, collected someone's registration data, and sometimes we do that here at Security Weekly. Largely, we rely on third-party vendors, which is kind of like a double-edged sword. Like, people may trust us, but now they also, by extension, have to trust this third-party vendor. So I'm kind of on the fence about like how that works. And believe me, I want to be totally transparent with the way we collect and store people's data, as we're all security professionals and very concerned about that. So today, if I were to develop an application that collected a registration form, like name and other, like your typical registration form, and then I would store that in the database, is there like a language and a framework in a backend database that you recommend that basically inherently is very resilient to injection attacks?
So I don't know that there's any definitive like language or framework itself, like standalone, that is resilient, but there is a concept called object relational mapping, or ORM.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're working in Python, or if you're working even in, say, I don't know, JavaScript, for example, in a whole Node.js stack,
Sure.
there are object relational mapping tools that extrapolate away or abstract away the entire concept of doing like an insert into the database. And so the reason that these are generally kind of the new path forward for working with databases is because if you have a single library that's used everywhere, for
Mm-hmm.
example, as long as that one library is secure, you're good. Now, to the extent that those are more thoroughly vetted and reviewed by security professionals on the overall is probably a good thing, because if you write your own or you roll your own, database queries, you may or may not be, kind of doing the same problems that you run into when you roll your own encryption, which is it has been thoroughly vetted and validated by security professionals. Whereas these object relational mapping tools have more or less extrapolated away or abstracted away the problem of a lot of injection attacks, which is interesting to me, because though the OWASP Top 10 is still a very useful tool for developers, there's been a lot of back and forth on whether it's still relevant. And for me personally, I would say, again, it depends. It depends on the frameworks and libraries, but it also depends on, in this case, if you're using an object relational mapping tool, you might not be even considering or even having to worry about injection attacks, as long as you're not writing your own queries into your actual calls to the database.
So the ORM doesn't execute a SQL command to get your data into the database?
So the ORM does. It basically allows you to streamline the process of inserting into the database from the development side without having to write your own queries for inserting into the database. So
I gotcha. Okay.
The best example is, in this case, it's the syntax. Like if I were to write the syntax of inserting into a database, insert user from what have you, yada, yada. That is usually where the problem is introduced with an injection-based attack, because if I can now mess up that query in some way based on my input, suddenly you have a very real problem of SQL injection, where I'm controlling the query that is now talking to the database. The other side of it, though, with object relational mapping, is I can simply say, use this object relational mapping tool to take this data and put it into the database for me. And it does all of the handling of safely escaping certain characters, making sure that the query is well formed. If it gets an error, for example, it's pre-database, in this case, if you're reading or writing, it's before it even hits the database, it can validate the information.
I gotcha.
So that in this case, I'm not like having to rely on the database to throw back an error or to block me from inserting. The ORM is kind of like a layer of defense that'll say, yeah, this is all good data. I've escaped everything appropriately. I can now put this data into the database without being concerned about an injection attack.
And so SQL Alchemy in Python is not that, right? That's still, or is it somewhere in between?
So I'm pulling up my project now because I'm trying to recall directly if SQL Alchemy is considered a ORM, because I know that there are tools out there specifically for doing this, and I'm actually trying to look up. Yeah, so in this case, SQL Alchemy is considered an actual ORM itself because it allows you to do the database calls using SQL Alchemy.
Okay, that's good. But now you still want to do some level of field sanitization as well.
Right, exactly. So you're going to do input sanitization from the actual fields that come in, and those are all going to be based on the actual model of the database. So you can actually define in Python the models themselves, what they look like, what they should be able to accept into the different fields accordingly. And you can use things like, I'm actually just pulling up kind of my code here. You can do things like, okay, is this a string value? If it is a string value, great. Like if someone tries to put in a non-string value in, you can just define it right there as like, yeah, no, this isn't going to work.
Yeah, and WT Forms makes that pretty easy, right?
Yes, then that's exactly it. WT Forms is the one that I've used in the InfoSec Mentors project application that I do for all of my validation, which is awesome because as long as you're being logical about the validation that you're performing, so a username, it can be, anywhere from a few characters to maybe 25 or 30 characters, but you don't need it to be unlimited, right? You don't need to say anyone can do a username of 3,000 characters. That's just ridiculous.
It's very easy in WT Form. We use WT Forms with SQL Alchemy in our internal application as well. And if you implement the features where you're like limit the length on every single field and limit the type, it's super easy. And I think that speaks to number one. Well, we could almost do a whole show on each one of the 10 of these, right? But we probably should. That wipes out a whole bunch of injection style attacks that they're talking about in this OWASP top 10 list.
Right, exactly. And so I think that to the extent that the reason that the OWASP top 10 exists is for us as developers, in this case, the folks that do all of the Security Weekly project work, and then myself as well, think about these problems in a way that can be easily resolved by things like an ORM, by things like WT Forms, for example. And so to that end, this is why the OWASP top 10 exists, but there are tools in place that are basically eliminating these classes of vulnerabilities in a fairly easy way, right? Like you put in WT Forms, you include SQL Alchemy, and suddenly you're pretty good. There's going to be very few instances where you're actually going to be introducing injection unless you're doing like a straight database call that's bypassing SQL Alchemy or saying, make the query this, which could be problematic. Do we want to move on to the next one? Because I know that we're probably going to run over time.
Yeah.
We'll go maybe through the top 5 this week. So
okay.
So broken authentication and session management also say the same at the second on the list. In effect, that's basically saying, look, if I go to a website and I am given a session token, that session token is well handled or well formed. And to that end, it's not a situation where the management of the session, right? So you can't say, I have the same session ID and then get into my session. It's following good hygiene of the management of it. So to that end, it stayed the same. Session hijacking attacks is kind of one of the things that they're trying to prevent here.
Well, sessions is a different one. Session manipulation was a different one than second one. The second one was broken authentication, where they're talking about credential stuffing, default credentials, weak passwords, that kind of stuff.
So, right, exactly. And so in this case, I'm just going back up here to the top. So with session management, that was the A2 in the previous 2013 version. And then now that's come across as just broken authentication, right? So they have split that out into multiple fields. And so
it's weird because they do talk about some session stuff in the new A2 with broken authentication, but they also talk more about a lot like having good passwords, and I don't know if they cover how to store the passwords. But again, this is a case, Keith, where there are pretty standard libraries out there that if I'm going to do authentication, I can implement and get around much of these issues without having to write a whole ton of code myself.
Right, and moreover, there's a lot of examples of things like using I don't know, like bcrypt, for example, right? Like how to work with bcrypt in terms of grabbing the password that's being set by the user, properly iterating it through bcrypt so that it gets properly hashed and stored, and then checked, right? Like these are all things that are very easy to implement inside of Python, for example. And to the extent that even now when we look at things like AngularJS or even React, they're doing a very good job of making this an easy thing to do. It's almost as though you have to go out of your way to do this poorly
I gotcha.
at the end of the day, which is nice. And to that end, with like things like, you know, automated credential stuffing, right? Like, so this is a situation where broken authentication could come out as I have a limited number of times that I can actually put the username and password into the application before it effectively locks the account, right? It's just simple, good hygiene like that, where I can say, okay, after the third attempted login, don't necessarily do something where we're thinking about telling them that they're now locked out, right? Like you can effectively say, or as an attacker, I should say, you can effectively go ahead and try to hijack an account by using the same username and password or different passwords and just trying to do credential stuffing here. If the application then tells you this account is now locked, I now know that that was a real account. It's locked, which is kind of unfortunate, but I can actually do user enumeration to some degree there. Whereas they're saying, look, if you can effectively prevent credential stuffing where you lock the account, but you do so in a way that doesn't really inform the user or the attacker, I should say, that it was or was not a real account, is even better, right? There are things that you can do to make authentication stronger, more resilient than otherwise might normally have been done in the past. And there are tools to make this easy. So part of this is design, and part of this is implementation when it comes to broken authentication. So to that end, I don't really have too much more to say other than, of course, making sure you're looking at things like the top 1,000 worst passwords, which is one of the things that they put in there, is making sure that you're having sane password requirements, but also encouraging users to use longer passwords more than anything else, because again, that's going to make a stronger password overall from a hashing to brute force or reversing that hash if the database was compromised, for example.
Gotcha. Next one is sensitive data exposure.
It's interesting that this is on this because I feel like we had and we actually just talked about one last week, right? We had a rash of open S3 buckets that are out in the world that people can get access to. So that is in itself, like, sensitive data exposure is any number of different problems, but to the extent that you're making sure you're encrypting credentials appropriately, such as credit card numbers, you should be hashing passwords so that they're not reversible. There are things that you have to be careful of here. And so whenever I go to say, like, you know, forgot password, if an email comes back to me that shows me the password of what I was using, rather than saying, okay, here is a cryptographically secure link to allow you to now reset your password, it begs the question of, okay, are you doing encryption on the back end and you're decrypting this appropriately and sending it to me, or are you just storing this badly? And so you have to be careful of things like, first of all, exposing your users to potentially, you know, databases that are left out there in the world unsecured, but of course, things like TLS, right? So leveraging HTTPS through things like Let's Encrypt to make sure that you're not exposing the user's credentials on the wire if they're connected to, like, a, I don't know, Starbucks Wi-Fi that's now mining for Bitcoin. So the next one on the list, Paul, I'll jump right into it, is XML external entities, which I found very interesting because a lot of people don't know about XML external entities, even though it has been the kind of attack that has been on the rise over the last few years or so. I mean, I've seen it more in the bug bounty space than anything else. I don't know if you want to jump in and you have anything to say about it. I'm happy to go a little bit deeper on it.
I would love to have you do that because I am not familiar with XML external entities.
So, in effect, what it is XML allows you to, in some cases, this is used for like an API or as an example of like things that you can do or requests that you can make. So, one of the things we're actually going to be talking about a little bit later in the news is related to remote procedure calls. And there are things like XML RPC that are built into WordPress or Drupal, for example, that allow you to make procedure calls to the back-end API or the back-end system that is running the web server or in this case, like Drupal. So the external entity is when you, the user or the attacker, can define an entity inside of that XML code, and then it will allow you to call that entity. So from a programming perspective, it's almost like you can define your own class or your own object and then call it, right? So to that end, depending on what you're doing from a security standpoint, if you can define an entity that is the server's Etsy password file, I can suddenly then call that or have it send that data to maybe a remote server. And when I call that entity inside of the XML information or the XML format, I'm suddenly able to introduce an entity that is external to the actual web server in the way it should exist because I've defined it, and I can make a call to it. A really good example of this is something that I've seen in bug bounty programs personally and in all of my own hunting, is XML RPC on WordPress that allows me to do external entity attack, which is a simple denial of service. I can define a single entity that is just a bunch of letters, right? It could be the letter A 1,000 times over, and then I can call that entity 1,000 times. And I can effectively lock up CPU cycles by defining the entity and calling it, which is where this attack comes in, because a lot of the times it's built into frameworks that a lot of people don't know about, and it just kind of exists in the back end. And unless you've taken the time to go and lock it down, you're suddenly exposing yourself to potentially reading directly from the file system on the server, or in this case, denial of service from a simple attack where I've defined the entity as just a really long string and then called it a lot.
And it's really whitelisting that prevents this attack. And from what I understand, like you define a whitelist and then your application doesn't work, so you just whitelist everything and then you're vulnerable. Is that typically how this works?
To some degree, yes. So, I mean, in this case, you do want to make sure you patch or upgrade the XML processors or libraries on a pretty regular basis, which is, again, something that a lot of people don't think about. But yeah, you have to whitelist the things that are expected to happen when an XML call is made to your server, right? So to the extent that with WordPress, as an example, there are predefined functionalities with WordPress and XML RPC that are intended to allow you to remotely push things like blog posts and what have you, or do user management, or comments and et cetera, et cetera. To the extent that you should be whitelisting what those commands are that you're allowed to run, and that you're checking for credentials, right? So there are ways with things like XML RPC where you can actually like log in or authenticate the request, and you should be making sure that those are locked down so that a default user with no password or a default password can't make the same requests to that system that otherwise might exist.
Awesome. And what's the fifth one?
So we'll go into the fifth one, and then I think we'll probably jump into the news and we'll cover maybe the remaining five next week or sometime in the future, is broken access control. So this is a situation where an attacker simply modifies the account parameter in a browser and can get a verified session. So for example, if I'm putting an account number in and I'm working with my bank and the query string is saying, oh, your account number is this, and then I just change that, suddenly it's like, okay, I'm now a different user on the system. So making sure that you're actually controlling the user session throughout and making sure you're properly validating each like account or session as it logs in or logs out, for example. A really good example of this more recently is looking at, so with things of the nature of banks, for example, making sure that you're doing proper controls of when a user logs out, they're actually like fully logged out. And to the extent that you can not navigate around, APIs are a really big problem here with access control, because to the extent that API access is an authentication token or key of some kind, and it's all or nothing, right? Like most of the time, you're not going to see distributed or disparate APIs to work within a monolithic application. It's going to be one API and one API key, and then you can do everything inside of that API even though you might not want that to be the case. So doing things like locking down your API are going to be really important, and not having proper access controls against API calls is going to be, and is probably why it's on this list now, a really big and emerging problem as we move into the whole DevOps world where we have microservices, because they all work on APIs. And to that end, if you're not controlling and securing those APIs accordingly, you're going to have a bad day. And we've seen that a lot again in the bug bounty space as well.
Awesome. So we'll cover the other 5 in some upcoming shows, and may even delve into some of these in even greater detail on upcoming shows. There's been a lot of updates since I really dug into the OWASP top 10, so that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I should say the reason that broken access control came into this is actually a merging of insecure direct object references and missing function level access control. So to the extent that I can make insecure direct object references, like I can make a call directly to maybe a PDF on the system, for example, that I shouldn't have access to, but I can. And then the function level access control is these users should be able to access this PDF and everybody else should not. So to the extent that it gets merged into one broken access control makes a lot of sense, because it can be used for a lot of different purposes, whether it's sharing files, or in this case also API calls that shouldn't be made by different users.
Awesome. So we're going to take a short break, come back and talk about devdocs.io and a whole bunch of news. So stay tuned. Hey, welcome back everyone to Application Security Weekly. We got the announcements out of the way, so we're just going to dive right into, I think we're going to start with devdocs.io before we get into some news. I've just started poking around on this. This is fascinating, Keith.
I think you're really going to like it, Paul. I mean, as a tool, I have to admit it. So I used this when I was flying out to San Francisco last year, building out.
Hey, Keith, I can't hear you. If we could cut the music. The music is really loud in my headphones. I really like it, though.
No, it's good. It's good. And so what I was saying was devdocs.io is a really interesting tool it's open source. It's free to use. The reason that I like it, though, is it allows you to choose which frameworks, libraries, documentation that you want to go ahead and cache to your browser, and then you can use it offline. And the reason that I really liked it is when I was flying out to San Francisco last year to go on site for BugCrowd at headquarters, I had a 6.5-hour flight, and I had a presentation that I was working on building. So I needed some Bootstrap and some CSS information so that I could make sure that it came together in the way that I wanted, because I was writing that presentation in Impress.js. And to that end, it was kind of nice being able to say, okay, I don't have to rely on maybe a little bit shoddy Wi-Fi on the plane, or even buy Wi-Fi on the plane. I just have this documentation at my fingertips. For those that aren't familiar with things like Git, for example, they even have technologies like Git in terms of how to go ahead and use that for debugging or administration or any number of other things that you might do in terms of patching. And then they even have languages, so Go, Python, frameworks such as AngularJS and React, as well as, of course, things like server-side information. So Nginx is a good example of one of the ones that I have, Apache HTTP server. And yeah, it's been pretty expansive, and it continues to grow. It is an open source project, so I actually have the link to the GitHub project as well, so you can run this locally as your own kind of server on your system if you wanted to. And yeah, check it out. It's probably one of the best tools that I've discovered in recent times.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great resource. Yeah, Nginx is particularly interesting because it's more like a programming language than I think Apache is. And I've done some migrations, and yeah, it requires some... I use programming language very loosely, though.
Well, I mean, it's it is something that the way that the file structure works, for example, and the way that you're supposed to put information in is very particular. It's what a developer might call as an opinionated framework. It tells you must do things in this way, otherwise it breaks, as I'm sure you've probably experienced.
Yeah, and it was like a weird thing where you couldn't do an if condition based on a negative condition. So you couldn't do if not this. And there was all these examples on how to get around that. I'm like, this is just bending the laws of physics and should never be done.
Yeah, exactly. And the other nice thing about it as well is, so even looking at like Nginx, they do have the ability to do different versions of software. So depending on Nginx might be not the best example here, but Docker is a really good example of different versions that have come out recently that you might want to have different documentation on. Or if you're like me and you tend to kind of, you're a mad scientist, you have your own laboratory of things that you're doing, you probably have different versions of documentation that are lying around based on the things that you're doing. And that's exactly what I've done here for my own setup.
Yeah, like the compose XML markup is the different versions are completely different in some instances. It's really annoying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I don't know if you want to move on to the news. I know that we have quite a lot to cover. So the one that I really wanted to cover first was how, and this is actually it's a fictitious article that is written in the realm of truth. And this is based on my experience of working with Node and NPM packages, which is basically how someone, specifically a malicious actor, would go about introducing bad code or malicious code into the Node package management libraries, or for example. And then from there, if they got that ingested into other libraries, so for example, now the one that they use here is, I want to be able to colorize my console log output so that I can more easily read it. If I were to make that the package that I was introducing and then bundle it into other Node packages that everybody is using, I can suddenly take my one malicious package in the Node package management library and suddenly introduce it into things that people are actually using. And by doing that, I can obfuscate my code in a way that is potentially malicious and therefore could allow me to receive people's credit cards. So again, the whole article itself is an act of fiction. But when I was reading it, I thought to myself, yeah, this could actually happen, and it probably will be something that we end up seeing here in 2018, because quite frankly, the whole idea of being able to just import a bunch of stuff and get my job done that much quicker without having to write a lot of code is more or less the way of DevOps in JavaScript as it exists today. So a little bit lengthier of an article. Definitely check it out and read it. Again, it is a work of fiction, but it's definitely grounded in some truth of things that I could see actually happening.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's scary at the same time. The next one is not unfortunately grounded in reality, which is Epic Games reporting pretty huge spikes in processing compute time as a result of the Meltdown Inspector patches to their cloud environment. In fact, in the two articles that I've cited here, they both have the same chart, and it shows the actual CPU utilization going from something like around 20-ish% to up over like the 50+% mark. So to the extent that if you're using cloud services today, post the release of those patches for Meltdown Inspector, go check your CPU utilization, and moreover, go check to see how much you're spending. Because if you're doing some heavy computation, as they are for hosting game servers, you're probably going to be doubling your cost just from this case, the actual patches that were rolled out to prevent the speculative execution vulnerabilities.
So they haven't figured out a way around that issue where patching it doesn't adversely affect performance.
Nope. So what it looks like in this case is...
It's pretty epic. Ha! Get it?
Right. Yeah. Poor for Epic Games, right? Like Fortnite, from everything I've heard, I don't play it myself, but some of my colleagues do, and they've spoken very highly of it. And it's kind of unfortunate that, in effect, for them to make the game as enjoyable an experience for their users, they were probably using that speculative execution pretty heavily, as was Postgres, for going back to databases for a moment. And as a result of the patches coming out, if that speculative execution is locked down, in this case, even like, maybe by a factor of 2, suddenly the actual CPU utilization doubles, and it's just a worst case scenario for a lot of cloud-based companies.
And so this CPU bug also affects CPUs on the video cards? Is that what NVIDIA drivers are fixing?
So yeah, actually, so it's in this case, NVIDIA is pushing patches for this, and it's you're correct. In this case, it's not the actual GPU chipset itself, or even the computing processors on the actual video cards. It's the drivers that interact with the CPU of the system.
Okay. Gotcha.
That is effectively being patched here. So to the effect that Spectre and Meltdown don't actually affect the GPUs themselves, their interaction with the CPU on the system, or on the motherboard in this case, is what needs to be patched, and that's the drivers between the GPU and the system itself, which is crazy, right?
It is crazy. And is there? Do you think there's a performance hit in your GPU now based on this driver update, or no? Because it's not the code that's running on the GPU; it's the code that interacts with the processor. You wonder if there's a performance hit now. Should we all go buy bigger video cards?
Well, if I said yes, I'm sure that everyone would be very happy about that, because they can have an excuse. Keith Hoodlet says you should buy a new video card because of this. So, honey,
I need to build a new gaming rig because Keith said so. Yeah.
Right. Well, so as much as I'd like to say yes, right now they're saying that there shouldn't be any performance hits to your GPU as a result of these patches. The one things that I always go back to is like the whole Radeon versus NVIDIA, right? Some people say, NVIDIA is great because of the drivers that allow you to get the best performance. They control the performance really well. Whereas ATI or the Radeons is like, yeah, you don't have very good drivers, but the chipset is really strong. And so to the extent that I imagine the interaction with the CPU on the system will have some performance hits, it's yet to be merited or drawn out per se, but we shall see.
Yeah, it's interesting. We got 5 years out of our system that does live streaming. I think is what the technologies, the CPU and motherboard and everything, estimates around 5 years old. And so we're building a new system with an i7 8700K, and like even just a $50 video card will suffice for, because we don't really need the video processing. There's a separate card that takes a feed into a PCI Express slot that sends it out. But we did put an external video card in it, and we did choose NVIDIA GeForce card, like a gig of RAM. It's like $50, just to offload that from the CPU, because we need as much CPU as possible to do the live streaming. I mean, and that's all it does in life, is just stream stuff. So
I'd be really interested for, especially your use case, Paul, to see if you're seeing any performance hits as a result of the Spectre and Meltdown patches, because I know a lot of people who were talking about even just compiling things, right? So compiling using like Gradle and Java-based compilation.
Yeah.
Saw pretty significant increases in compilation times. I mean, from a factor of 5 minutes to 20 minutes, which is pretty significant. And if you're doing... I imagine that especially for companies like Microsoft who do pretty monolithic, compilation of their code into a single deliverable or binary, right? Like that's going to be pretty interesting to see how that all changes over the next 6 months.
Yeah, it's hard to tell if the problem's gotten worse because it is, it's basically older hardware that's running newer software, which probably, and actually in my reading, is tuned to take advantage of the newer processors. So even if there is a performance hit, will likely still be well under any threshold, because even just moving to an i7 platform, there's some processor feature that I can't remember the name of it, but they're like, you should definitely have this processor feature because we use it in our software, and it greatly helps performance. So
as long as it wasn't speculative execution, I think you're fine.
It was not. I definitely would have recognized if it was speculative execution. I don't remember what it was, but yeah, it's software from Telestream. It's actually called Wirecast. So
very cool. That's actually really neat.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting once that system comes together. We can talk about it on the show.
Yeah, and that'd be actually really fun, especially because we can start to nerd out about all the different things you can do with it.
Absolutely.
one of the things I do want to, speaking of, systems that are running important software, right? So the Oracle WebLogic vulnerabilities that were actually patched back in October of last year are now being seen as being exploited by Bitcoin miners, which I thought was kind of telling, right? Because in this case, if you have flaws of this nature, 6 to 8 months ago, it probably would have been just ransomware campaigns. And it sounds like more and more that we're seeing everybody switch over to suddenly using those systems that are now being compromised to mine for cryptocurrency, whether it's Bitcoin or otherwise. And to the extent that Oracle's WebLogic here has one CVE 2017 10271 that is rated as critical, and to the extent that it's also in use largely by education institutions or educational institutions, is interesting to me because, as you know, Paul, from your history of working in the realm of education, patching systems is probably not a high priority on their list. And quite frankly, those systems are also probably pretty beefy because they need to support a lot of students. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on patching in the world of universities and education.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where WebLogic plays into the educational software market. I'm not sure what exactly it's used for in education.
I wonder if it's like student records, honestly, because it does say, web server or WebLogic server, PeopleSoft, Banner, Oracle Identity Manager.
Oh, okay. You said it. Banner is kind of like the ERP enterprise management for universities. So that's why most universities, to manage students, finance, financial aid, all of that stuff, will implement Banner in their back end as their enterprise platform of choice. Whereas enterprises, right, they're usually SAP or another Oracle, a different set of products from, probably a lot of the same back end stuff, but Banner packages that enterprise applications for educations. So that's why you're seeing it come from Ren ISAC, because it's heavily used in education.
Gotcha. And it's interesting to me as well, because if you think about it, right, like think about the dynamic change here. These are systems that are used for things like financial aid, right? They are literally handling not only students' PII, but also money. And they're not being used. This vulnerability isn't being used necessarily to steal all of that information, and maybe it is. But that it's being used to now mine cryptocurrency says a lot about the value of cryptocurrency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they can probably fly under the radar, certainly, more so than stealing information and then selling it. They can fly under the radar more easily by just using it for mining and still make some money on it. That's probably would be my guess in the approach.
Yeah, probably. I mean, and that is, it is kind of an interesting world that we live in, especially because of the fact that people that are basically handling cryptocurrency, right, seem to be doing it not so well. Specifically, Brian Krebs on Krebs on Security calls out Coinbase for their handling of what is Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, I believe, is the other one, is the fork. And I don't know if you managed to see any of this article. It was late breaking news, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. I'm happy to jump into it if you didn't get a chance to look at it.
Yeah, this is a Krebs article on a website glitch let me overstock my Coinbase. It's interesting.
Yeah, and effectively what it is in this case, at overstock.com, he could use or select Bitcoin as the payment method. But what he could then do is he would be able to change that payment method when he was going to check out to Bitcoin Cash. And Bitcoin Cash, comparatively speaking, is something like, if you were to take $100,000 Bitcoin Cash in Bitcoin value, Bitcoin Cash is like $15,000, right? So for a $78 purchase, he was able to basically purchase it for what was equivalent $12 in Bitcoin Cash. And so to that end, his hypothetical situation here is, if you spend say maybe $100,000 on a 3-carat platinum diamond ring, but pay for it in Bitcoin Cash for $15,000, and then return it to Overstock, they would return you Bitcoin, not Bitcoin Cash.
Gotcha.
So you would now make $85,000 in profit off of this, which is, again, it's like here you literally have the magic of 1 + 1 = 4.
Mm-hmm. Sweet.
So, yeah.
Hopefully they fix that issue.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Well, I mean, when Brian Krebs comes calling, he is the world's intrusion prevention system. So maybe, who knows? But it was kind of interesting to hear that come out, because it's like, yeah, this is just a simple. People might have, like, thinking about the way that this was developed on the back end, right? Maybe they didn't actually differentiate what was Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash and the mechanisms or the features that were handling payment. And at the end of the day, they just, they didn't cross the wires appropriately, or they didn't separate out those wires appropriately, and they were now crossed and on the front end and the back end.
I like how Brian tested this vulnerability and actually made some profit. I don't know how much exactly that was. It wasn't $85,000, right? It was like $77.80, it looks like. He offered to send it back to overstock.com, and they were like, no, just keep it. And he donated it to archive.org, which I think is awesome.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Brian. It's almost like he got it as a bug bounty, right?
Yeah, pretty much, right?
So that's awesome of him, but to put it out to archive.org. They're great people. So.
Absolutely.
More problems, by the way. So getting back to processors for a moment, AMD's chip internally, the PSP chip, which is built in as a security trust zone, has a remote code execution flaw built into it. So this went full disclosure on January 3rd over on seclists.org. So most people would refer to that as where you can get Nmap or get more information on Nmap. So it's basically the firmware trusted platform module is allowing you to go ahead and get stack-based buffer overflow, which was found based on the researchers doing static analysis of the actual processing languages.
We actually covered this on Hack Naked News this week. Doug White did an expert commentary on it to kind of, because everyone was talking about Meltdown Inspector, and we talked about that with Jake Williams, aka Malware Jake, on Paul Security Weekly. Doug was like, I want to cover this AMD thing because it's kind of like flying under the radar, so I'm glad you added it here as a reminder. If you want more about that, Keith, you're more than welcome to expound upon it, but Doug actually did a whole segment on it.
I'll defer to Doug in this case. I mean, I was looking at the actual vulnerability that they have and the proof of concept that they have up on SecLists. And the remote code execution against a processor that's a security trust zone inside of an AMD system, bad, real bad.
Well, and the crux of the issue was there was no ASLR, there was no NX bit. NX bit is the NX bit, right? Non-executing, yeah, NX bit or Canary. Like none of the remediation features, I'll call them, to prevent stack-based execution were implemented in this particular coprocessor, as I understand it, which was kind of the scary part of the article.
Yeah. And it's like, come on, guys. I mean, you'd think that it would be turtles all the way down when it came to security. They would do it at every level, but somebody dropped the ball here somewhere. So. Yep. PHP, by the way, is in none too good shape either. I know that they had some issues. I think it was, 2 weeks ago. I remember you had a PHP related issue on the Paul Security Weekly show notes. And so this is more of a continuation of badness. If you look at the actual technical summary, there is something like 20 or 30 bugs for version 7.2.1, 7.1.13, 7.0.27. It's bad. It's really bad. And to the extent that, remote code execution, or arbitrary code execution, important distinction there. Arbitrary code execution is not remote necessarily. Mm-hmm. But to the extent that some of these bugs, looking at them, so for example, you have one that's remove file name from output to avoid cross-site scripting, right? Like that's something that you could potentially have real problems with if you have a non-admin user now being able to get cross-site scripting stored against other users based on like a file name that was stored in email attachment. Needless to say, these are all sorts of badness, segmentation faults. So again, it's like, okay, now you have denial of service, that if you can get a seg fault on the web server, there you go, you're done. And if it's trivial, it's real bad. So,
it also looks like it affects PHP 5 as well.
Yeah. PHP 5.6.33. There's only a couple of them, so it's less so. But I wonder if that's because in this case maybe people didn't go deep into PHP 5, given how old it is at this point.
Correct.
So I imagine, well, kind of as WordPress is to Paul Security Weekly, I imagine that PHP will be a continued problem until eventually it goes the way of Flash, which is it never dies.
Pretty much. I mean, yeah. I mean, to run WordPress, you still, of course, need PHP. I don't see that. It'd be interesting to rewrite WordPress in a new framework.
JavaScript. Basically, it would be JavaScript if it was going to be done that way. But.
Right? Yeah, it would be some kind of like Angular Node thing. I just, it's going to be so much time until something comes even close to the ecosystem that WordPress has created for its user base. So we're going to be, in my estimation, stuck with PHP for a long time, unfortunately.
Probably true. And I know that we're going to be wrapping up here in a few minutes, so we're going to skip over the Western Digital MyCloud series of vulnerabilities. All I will say is there is an unrestricted file upload that is remotely exploitable. There's a hard-coded backdoor, which we talked about last night on Paul's Security Weekly. Also, cross-site request forgery, which I think 2 weeks ago on Paul's Security Weekly I said is kind of going the way of the dinosaur. Maybe not.
Yeah, not in IoT-based systems.
Right. And it's interesting because that also cross-site request forgery was dropped from the OWASP top 10 in the 2017 model. So who knew? But yeah, command injection, denial of service, information disclosure, bad. Yeah, so needless to say, go check out that in the show notes because it's not good. The JSON RPC or JSON remote procedure call. This is something where an Electrum wallet, which is a wallet repository for cryptocurrency that exists out on the web, right? So it's kind of like Coinbase, for example. In this case, they were remotely exploitable via JSON RPC calls from a web server. So your JSON or your Electrum wallet could be given instructions if you had a browser open for your Electrum wallet and you went to a website that leveraged this JSON RPC exploit. So again, badness in general. The ones that I wanted to close out on specifically, though, is that a new cybersecurity office has been proposed, which for companies like Equifax, if this had existed in the shape and form that it was brought up in legislation, the fines that Equifax would have been hit with as a result of their breach would have been upwards of, I think, if it didn't have a cap, it would have been $14 billion. But
that's
it would
pretty
have been capped
significant.
Yeah, no kidding. In this case, the actual legislation is a 50% of the company's gross revenue for the previous fiscal year. So yeah, I think in this case, ended up being like an equivalent 1.5 billion if this had existed as legislation and this office had existed. But it goes to show that especially our representatives in Congress and in the Senate are not joking around when it comes to making sure that you're doing security for your organization. And as we see application security becoming more and more the forefront of security breaches and in this case also security practices that need to take place, we're going to probably see a lot more investment in this space. So stay tuned.
I just feel like the fine amounts are somewhat interesting. Like if it's not enough, as was the case with the FTC and VTech, it was like $650,000. That's not enough of a kind of a threat to the business to force them to make major changes. Maybe it is, and we have seen evidence that we talked about where when fines do come down that category or industry, other players are like, well, I want a bug bounty program and I do want to make changes. If the fines are too much, I don't think that, I think in legal battles, they'll be like, you can't put us out of business with a fine because we made a mistake. And they'll probably work to show, how they can either were more diligent than it appeared on the surface and how they'll be more diligent in the future to get those fines down. Because, you can't, again, force a company out of business because they had a security vulnerability. Now, of course, there's a lot of factors that play into that, a lot of different scenarios. But I don't think that the government is going to force a company to go out of business because they had a security breach. Who knows? Maybe they could, but I think that in legal, with various legal teams and large companies, that certainly that's going to be taken into account and be fought.
And I would say that the most important thing about this particular piece of legislation that they've put forward is specifically to companies like Equifax that, in this case, are managing like PII that is effectively your whole life, right? So it's not every single company that would fall into this, but it's the Data Breach Prevention and Compensation Act is designed to affect companies that have a good deal of your information. So not just like, Paul Security Weekly lost its list of registered listeners, for example, right? Like that wouldn't be something that would be a 50% gross revenue event for you based on this legislation. Which is, but still though, for the really big organizations out there, it's kind of like GDPR, right? Like if this gets passed, even in some form, if it's not a 50% of gross revenue, and that's like the high point for negotiation purposes, even if it's 25% or 10%, that's no longer a small number, right? Like 650,000 like VTech was. The last one that I wanted to wrap up on, though, Paul, if you wanted to do just one more.
Okay, let's do it. Just one more.
Was the it's kind of like the Steve Jobs one more thing.
That's right.
So the one more thing of today's episode is a Microsoft Secure article on application fuzzing in the era of machine learning and AI. And I thought it was interesting because as companies are moving to the left, right, they're trying to get implementations of security, SaaS and DAST tooling in place to actually scan for vulnerabilities before it's ever released or even built in some cases. This is an article that talks about how things like machine learning and AI can be leveraged to continuously fuzz applications for vulnerabilities, even including things like neural fuzzing is what they call it at the very end of the article. So I will leave our listeners with that. Definitely go out and check out that article. If you're looking at what the next 5 to maybe 10 or 15 years of application security looks like, I think that this is going to be a part of it. So put this on your radar.
Sweet. Well, Keith, thank you very much for this awesome episode of Application Security Weekly. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.